Alright, this is the story of Laxus Dreyar from Fairy Tale. My favorite character from Fairy Tale. I'll talk about that guy. So, Laxus was born a member of Fairy Tale. His grandpa, Makarov, was the guild master, and he was, thrilled about being a part of the guild. He was like, damn, one day when I grow up, I'm going to be, a part of your guild, and actually be a wizard and shit. And, Makarov was like, yeah, and he always went to the Fantasia parade with his grandfather and other things, and he liked doing that shit, But eventually, time passed and other things, and Laxus did become a member of Fairy Tale. He had shown promise and other things, like his magic was powerful. He became like an S-rank wizard, like actually pretty quick. And, and he is the grandson of Makarov too, so it was like, people knew it was going to happen, but he's kind of like living in the shadow of his grandfather and other things, so he's like kind of a rebellious teenager, kind of. He's like, I'm a guy that has my own fucking strength. People are comparing me to you too much. That shit's weak. You can't do shit like that. And then they go, and he goes and he, kicks his father out of the guild. See, his father, Laxus' father's name was Ivan. Ivan was, trying to use powers to fuck with Fairy Tale, take the power away and use it for his nefarious purposes. When it's used for, it's the body of the first guild master and shit, she needs to be in there. That's it's kind of like it's a powerful weapon, but it's also, sacred to the guild. It has a lot of meaning and shit. Only the guild master knows about it, really. Ivan knew about it because he's the son of Makarov, and then he was like, okay, maybe I can use this power to get an edge over or take over the guild and other things and have it like me and then build it in my image. And then Laxus was like, we're doing that, and then people look at me certain ways because of you, but then you like took it too far and you fucking kicked my father out of the guild too. Now I don't like you. But he's still stuck with the guild, and he did, his part. He took care of, villains that showed up and other things, because he was like one of the ones who could do it, when nobody else could. At that time, Natsu and Gray were still not like that. They were, but they weren't. They were still, working on their magic and shit. Urza was, kind of, she's coming up too. She's an S-class wizard, but she ain't like Laxus or Mystic or Gildarts. Those three guys were like, the guys of Fairy Tale. And when Phantom Lord attacked the guild, Laxus was off with his group. This is years later and shit. And he's like, you guys gotta figure that shit out yourself. You have, Urza, she's a big girl. And Mary Jane, because she was the one calling and shit. You're, big enough to, handle that shit yourself. You ain't little girls. He had his entourage with him, the Thunder Legion, Freed, Big Slow, and, Evergreen, and they were, doing other missions. But at that time, they actually did need his help. And he didn't show up for them, and, they kind of like, a little bit like, damn, he's kind of an asshole, a douchebag. He wants to not help us out, But he was like, giving, credit where credit was due, but like kind of not, because they actually did need his help. They might have been S-class wizards and other things, but they were asking for his help, and they were like, he wasn't doing it. And so then, later on, he came back, and he was like, the guy, because Gagio had joined the guild, and he was like, this guy, he fucked with our guild mates, and he also made us look bad. He destroyed our guild hall and all kind of shit, but he's like a member of Fairy Tale now. This shit is weak. Like, you accept shit like this in this guild because the old man wants to play games and shit and allow shit like this to happen. And he got pissed, and he like, started a whole like battle for Fairy Tail and shit. And he was like, I'll take over the guild and shit and rule with like power. Only the strong can be here. Weak people are not allowed here. So Evergreen turned all the females to stone, and then the guys were fighting in the streets. If you want to save the females, you have to all fight. And then you all have to fight me too, or the whole city of Magnolia will be destroyed by my lightning palace, because we had set a spell. It was an enchantment spell too, set on the place because of Freed. Freed locked in Makarov, so he couldn't intervene in the fight. Makarov couldn't fight in the battle, but Makarov also had, some problems and shit, because he's older and shit. He had a heart attack or something like that, so then Poluska had to come. But they eventually got the girls out, that being Gagio and Natsu. And then the girls came to fight with the guys and be like, stop, fighting, we're all right and other things. And they're like, but Laxus is having this fucking battle and stuff. We ain't trying to fight each other, but he believes that he can, take over the guild better than Makarov, and that we're all weak and other shit. And they're like, Natsu's like, Laxus is just, hype for the festival. That's what he thought at first. He's just, doing that because of the festival and it's another day. And then he was like, no, Laxus is like, it's too late now, I've already started this, rebellion and other things. I can't pull back now. I have to take over the guild and everything and kill everybody who's weak, who would like go against what I fucking see for Fairy Tail. And then, Michigan showed up, and he was like, okay, you might be able to beat me because you are S-Class wizard like me. And Laxus happened to do some research and know some things about Michigan. Now, he looked like somebody else. A guy named Jalal, but he ain't Jalal. Urza and Natsu were confused when, like, they came into the fight and they saw, like, a guy that looked like Jalal standing there. And they're like, what? That's Jalal. I just, kicked his ass a couple weeks ago. Is what Natsu said, but that wasn't him. It was somebody else. Michigan, somebody from another world. But he left and shit, I don't know. That's just how the story was wrote. And then Laxus fought against Urza for a little bit. Then, Natsu was like, I'll handle him. And then, Natsu was getting, beat. He was. Laxus was just, a better, wizard than him, more powerful magic and other things, more experience, faster than him. But then, Gagio showed up and he was like, we have to take care of this guy. He's powerful. Does that look like the guy you like grew up with in the guild and other things? Or is that a fucking enemy? Because that looks like an enemy to me. I just joined the guild yesterday, but I can tell who's my enemies and who's my fucking friends. That guy's not, he's not, your friend anymore. And then they're like, he was like, you're right, we can't find this guy unless, we get rid of all this lightning. So they had to team up and fight him. But even when they teamed up to fight him, they still weren't enough. He, shot them with a, dragon roar, and he allowed them to see his, dragon slaying magic. And he was even more powerful. But then Natsu got like, power amps. He was like, after, he tried to pull off fairy law and like kill everybody who was like he deemed weak. But deep down inside, he didn't want to kill nobody. He just, didn't understand why, people were weak, and why he had to defend, the weak people of Fairy Tail. He didn't see all that, He didn't see that, people actually cared about each other. It was a family and other things. He forgot about all that shit, and he was just like, a guild's supposed to be strong. A guild's supposed to be better than other guilds. We look weak when we accept other people from, you know, and this shit happens, you know. But then Natsu and him fought, and then he was defeated. But, you know, it was really to a draw because they were both fucked up. Like, all three of them were fucked up. You know, Godzilla got hit by lightning and shit. They were in crushes and other stuff. But, like, goddamn, Laxus was still, you know, walking around on his 2 feet, you know, not as bandaged up. And he was like, you know, where's, you know, the old man shouldn't even, you know, talk to him. And he was like, you know, you did, you know, fucked up shit, you know, you attacked your guildmates, you know, people who, you know, call this place home, a family and other things, you know, you have to get the fuck out of here now, you know. And he didn't want to, but he had to. And then he was like, I understand, you know, he got the shit, you know, knocked out of him, you know. And he was like, you know, I get it, you know, I was, you know, too extreme in the ways I was trying to do things, you know. And he went and he left. But then he came back, you know, he came back at the right time too. See, he came back during the fight with Hades. When Hades showed up, the guild was like really like in dire need of some strength and power, you know. And the two things that Laxus had, you know, he knew something was up, you know. It was the fairy tale emblem that was like still there, you know. It was still a part of him. You know, it was just in his blood and shit, because his great-grandfather started the guild and other things, and then, you know, he got there, and he saved Natsu, and then he started fighting against Hades, and now he was, like, doing shit to Hades. He was the one who, like, got him down to, you know, lower health bars, if you will, you know. But then, you know, even he couldn't defeat Hades. You know, Hades is the second guild master of Fairy Tale. He was the second guild master of Fairy Tale. And he was like, damn, you know, even I have, you know, I'm powerful, but I still can't beat this guy. I was like, damn. So he gave his powers to Natsu, and then Natsu obtained a new form called Lightning Fire Dragon Slayer mode. And he used that to, you know, try to defeat Hades too. You know, with the help of Carla and Happy and Panther Lily, who destroyed the Devil Heart. They were able to take down Hades together. Laxus mounted the attack. You know, he said, you know, don't give up, Fairy Tale. You know, fucked this shit up. And then, you know, at the end of it, you know, Makara was like, you can't be here. You know, you can't be here. You know, you were exiled. You were, you know, expelled from the guild and other things. He's like, I know, but I had to come because I knew something was up. You know, and he was like, you know, if you want me to leave, I'll leave, you know. I just came because, you know, you guys were in trouble, and I knew you were in trouble, so I came. And then he did that, and then he, you know, left for a little bit. You know, after the 7-year time skip, because they all had to, like, band together to use the fairy sphere, because Acnologia had showed up, and then the island had disappeared for 7 years, and then it reappeared. And then when it reappeared, you know, Laxus was gone for a little bit, you know. People were, you know, Makarov was still like, you know, I don't know if Laxus should join the guild again. You know, he did, you know, betray us back in the, you know, day, but then he saved them from, you know, Hades, and Hades was a fucking real threat. So then they were like, you know, weighing things out. You know, when Gildarts became the guild master for like 5 seconds, he like basically gave Laxus his, you know, membership into the guild back. You know, he was a guild member again. And then, you know, Makarov was just like, whatever, you know. He's my grandson, and he can, you know, fuck shit up, I guess, for us. He ain't gonna do the dumb shit he did before. And then it was the Grand Magic Games, and he was in the Grand Magic Games. But during the Grand Magic Games, his father appeared, you know, and he had his own guild called Raventail, you know, and they knew something was up with Ivan and shit, but they didn't know what was going on. And he did pull some shady shit, you know. So during the fight, you know, he was fighting against Laxus, but he performed a magic spell to make it look like Laxus was losing the fight, but really they were fighting in a pocket world. And he had like all the guild members with him, all of his guild members who were fighting in the Grand Magic Games. And then, you know, Laxus defeated all of them by himself. And pretty easily too. That was like low diff. And he got that done. And then, you know, as the Grand Magic Games progressed, it got to the last day, and then Laxus had to, fight against Olga Nonagir. That was a guy from Sabretooth. He was a lightning god slayer. He used black lightning. But he wasn't worried about that guy as much because Juranikas was in the match. And see, he was one of the 10 Wizard Saints. He was like, damn, this guy's on par with my grandfather, People know that shit, and like, I know it too, this guy is going to be the real fucking, monster that I have to worry about. And he, he knocked out Olga. That was, Jura that did that. And then he was like, you're the grandson of Makarov. I want to see what you can do. And he was like, hold on, I'm not that. I'm Laxus. You're fighting me. You ain't fighting that old man. And then, Laxus was able to defeat, Jura. But it wasn't easy, It was a real fight. But he was able to win, and then he got that win for them, and it put him over the edge. And eventually, Fairy Tail won that Grand Magic game. And then after that, the dragon attacked, and then Laxus had to fight, because he's a Dragon Slayer, a second-generation Dragon Slayer. So he has a Dragon Slayer Lacrima, a place inside of him. He was never raised by a dragon or seen a dragon before, until that moment. Oh, well, really when he found out Logia, but then, here in the Grand Magic Games, these dragons were weaker. He could help out and fight against these dragons, because he had dragon slaying magic, and there was only 7 dragon slayers, unlike in the past. So they had to, there was 7 dragons, and there was 1 for each dragon slayer to fight. And that's what they, did, and they were able to handle that shit, with the help of Natsu, defeating, Future Rogue. And then later on, Tartaros was starting to attack. They attacked the Magic Council, and they destroyed, they killed everybody there, basically. They were going to have to be revealed the Magic Council later on, but Mr. Yajima was at his shop, and he was like, the Thunder Legion was working for him, like for a job, just some little job, because they didn't know that fucking Tartaros was going to attack. And then, one of the guys came there, and he sent Bane particles out, which is anti-magic particles that fuck with people, make them sick, It's part of a curse that this guy has. But Laxus showed up, and he, killed that guy. But this guy is immortal. He can come back. He knows how to respawn and shit. And Laxus, he had took in so much of these Bane particles. He was inside. He was bed. He was in bed for a while. But after a while, the whole guild was fighting, and he was like, damn, I can't be in bed. I'm one of the, real players here. I have to be there too. I have to fight too. And he got there, and he fought against the guy who, put him full of Bane particles, anti-magic particles, and he was like, damn, this guy just won't fucking give up. But he hit him so hard that he couldn't recoup no more. But also, Mira Jane helped him too, because the place that was, the recoup chamber, if you will, for these demons and shit, got destroyed. So, he couldn't respawn anymore. But he was still sick from the Bane particles after that. He had to, take a nap after that, because he had been fighting too much. And then, after all that shit happened, after all that happened, Makarov was like, we fought against this enemy, we defeated them. However, there's something, I have to do. I have to disband the guild. He didn't tell them why or anything, and they were like, we fought against enemies before, and we, made it out. We made it out of this thing. Everybody's cool. What the fuck's going on? And he couldn't tell them. Because he did believe that the Alvarez Empire was like even more powerful than, all these other people they fought. So he was going to try to handle shit himself. So nothing ever got to that continent that they were on. And he had to dismember the guild for that. So then Laxus joined Blue Pegasus for a little bit. And then, Natsu and the, main gang, got, Makarov from Alvarez Empire. And then Adriel, some guy who's a saint, gonna, destroy them, and then he showed up and hit him with some lightning, and saved those guys, and he could have like killed that guy. This Laxus, he's kind of cool, so he's like, flex a little bit, not too much. Then, they fought again, not that guy, but he fought somewhere out. A guy named Wall. This guy had, he was a mech. He's made of machine. He has, he could detect that there was Bane particles in his system still, even a year later. And he was like, it was kind of evident too, because after he was fighting him for a while, and it was hard for Laxus too, because this guy he's a machine, right? So like, when he hits him with the lightning, it's just recharging him. But, luckily for Laxus, he has hard hits still. He's a big guy who hits hard too. He doesn't just hit with the lightning, he has hard hits too. So he was still in the fight kind of, but then, he had to, power up, he had to go past the regular lightning. He had to pull out some, like what I would call Conqueror's hockey. He had to pull off some like Conqueror hockey moves, red, black lightning, and he destroyed Wall with that, lightning that goes past lightning, that is red as the blood in my veins. That shit, destroyed Wall, and he was, the winner of that fight. Then he, had to witness, Acnologia, run around and try to destroy shit. But then his magic and everybody else's magic was used to put that guy in a bubble. Like basically everybody in Fairy Tail, like the whole series, like put their magic together to put this guy in a bubble. And then he was also, well, actually, he wasn't there to do that. I lied. He was there to fight against Acnologia, though, and he fought him in the rift between time. He was there with the other Dragon Slayers, but he was ineffective. He had to give his magic to Natsu. And everybody, all the Dragon Slayers gave their magic to Natsu, and Natsu defeated Acnologia. And then, Laxus was still alive at the end. And he's in the 100 Years quest, but I don't talk about that because I want to finish watching that. And yeah, that's the story of Laxus Dreyar from Fairy Tail. Fairy Tail is a good anime to watch, for many reasons. It has the best looking females in it, that's what I see. When I watch Fairy Tail, I see that. And, I'll stand on that shit forever, I'll say that to y'all. Other people can agree or disagree, but I know Hiramashima's work as far as that goes. And then like this character right here, he's powerful, he's strong, If you like shonen and powerful characters like that, you know what Laxus can do. He is like that. But stay cool, on the corner, and that was the story of Laxus Dreyar.